Hey guys, it's Sarah, and I have been gone for like a month. But this video is not about that, right? This video is about me forcing my opinion down your throat, and your job is to agree with me wholeheartedly and or cyberbully me in the comments. Right? Those are our roles. Let's begin. So, I am not going to assume everyone watching this video knows what's happening with Eleanor and Park, mostly because I was not aware of the discourse surrounding this book up until May of 2019. And why May of 2019? If you know anything about this book, Eleanor and Park, you know that it is a YA contemporary book written by Rainbow Rowell that was released and was pretty popular back in 2012. I actually have read this book before. I read it in 2012. I was a young teeny bopper, and I adored this book. But why now? Why 2019? Mostly because Eleanor and Park is getting a movie adaptation. With the recent news surrounding this book getting a movie deal came the resurfacing of a larger conversation centering on the poor representation in this book and the embedded racism. So naturally, I had to take a pause when I saw this on my timeline back in May of 2019 because I, up until this point, had not been aware of this discussion, although upon further reflection, it's been going on for a little bit. Since this book came out, people have been complaining about, or critiquing, I think it's a better word, critiquing the representation in this book. Naturally, 12-year-old me, 19-year-old me were wildly different. So the reason why I've decided to reread this book and, provide my 2 cents in this video format is because first and foremost, I'd like to solve the dissonance between, this great book that I have in mind versus what people are saying about this book. Oh, this book hurt me, this book is poorly written. So it was good to reread on that front alone, but also just in general to maybe let people who have heard about this book and have heard about, the poor representation in this book have a video to really grasp onto that explains why people are upset, even though I'm sure there are plenty of other people out there who are more qualified to talk about this, or they have a more in-depth or a better explained analysis of this book. I'm still giving it my shot because content. So I think it is fair to say that this book has problems. I hardly ever annotate books. I usually annotate them whenever I have a class assignment or, I really have some things I want to say about them, usually not the best. And surprise, surprise, people were onto something when they said that the race and representation in this book was not good. And more than that, the writing in this book is not good. There are a lot of issues with the development of this book and the way this book was executed. If you take nothing away from this video, just take this. I think a lot of the issues centering on race and representation in this book, mostly that it is bad, centers on bad writing choices, just bad writing choices, lazy writing choices, and ignorance on the part of Rainbow Rowell and the people who worked on this book. I feel like a lot of this could have been avoided had there been more, in-depth developmental edits on this book. Obviously, this is all easier to say in hindsight, but I just wanted to get that out there. So with that being said, I think we should begin with the secondary characters in this book, namely the secondary characters of color, before we lead on to the main event that is Park. So Park is not the only character of color in Eleanor and Park. There are actually a handful of other characters of color in this book, and they're all written poorly, and they're all stereotypical, and they're all worth talking about. So let's begin with Mindy Sheridan. Mindy Sheridan is Park's Korean immigrant mother. She is characterized in this book as being small, petite, docile, fragile, basically the stereotype attributed to Asian women in the United States. There's actually a point in this book where Eleanor describes Mindy as being a, quote, dainty china person. When she first meets Mindy, she compares herself to her and thinks of her as being a fragile china doll that her white husband, Park's white father, had to kidnap from Korea and bring here. And that's not the best on multiple fronts, right? The first of which being that it implies that all Asian people look the same. Obviously, Mindy is a Korean immigrant, like I previously stated, and in referring to this Korean woman as being a China person, I feel like that just explains itself, And then second, it further characterizes Mindy and places her in this role, this stereotypical role, as being the fragile, docile, submissive, Asian woman, the one that is fetishized in the Western media. There is actually a part in this book where Park laments his mother's Korean accent, quote, because she was apparently never going to stop sounding like she just got here yesterday from Korea. And this is on page 25. So Park continues this way of thinking by wondering if his mother keeps the accent because his father likes it, which is very gross and fetishistic. But then Park immediately discards the thought because his mother tries to assimilate in every other aspect. It would make no sense that she keeps this, appalling, embarrassing accent on purpose. So another two characters who are characters of color in this book that are poorly dealt with are Bibi and Denise. So Bibi and Denise are Eleanor's two best friends. When she transfers to this new school, she's bullied, and the two people who befriend her are Bibi and Denise, who are two black girls. And they get literally no page time, they get no due diligence, they get no further development, despite being the two characters who really take Eleanor in and provide her a support whenever she goes through the bullying, the torment at school. The only things that we really know about Bibi and Denise is that they are stereotypical black girls. If you don't know how black girls are propped up in the media, how they're stereotyped, it's like the whole, they're sassy and they're always ready to fight and use African American vernacular, and they roll their neck and they roll their eyes and they smack their lips. It's like that kind of stereotype. It's not flattering, to say the least. And that's all there is to Bibi and Denise. They're just there for Eleanor. And when Eleanor gets bullied, they threaten to beat people up. They, say girl, and they use slang, and it doesn't feel authentic. I read these exchanges between Eleanor and Bibi and Denise, and I just know in the back of my head, oh, a white girl is writing this. A white girl is really boiling down the identity of black people, black girls in particular, and she's presenting us this half-assed rendition. And it's just not well done. Obviously, there are people who fill out some of the stereotypes that are attributed to them. There are Asian women who are docile and they own beauty shops and they, speak in thick accents and they speak in pidgin English and they are good at math and they, fill out a list of things that are attributed to them. And there are black girls who roll their necks and roll their eyes and they're sassy and they're quick to fight and, they're a bit temperamental. But at the end of the day, these stereotypes are incomplete. And in Rainbow Rowell, propping up these characters and saying their race, their stereotype fully defines them, is lazy, right? She's using a stereotype as shorthand for characterization. She's using stereotypes to do the bulk of the work that she has in writing characters. But more than that, it's using these characters as props, right? The only relevant thing about them, the thing that is center to who they are, is their race. And people deserve to be more than their race. They deserve to be more than their marginalization. People deserve to have stories. Even if they're secondary, tertiary characters, they deserve to be treated as actual human beings rather than, props to make the story seem more interesting or to, make a half-assed point, which I'll get more to that later. So another secondary character that I want to talk about, a character of color, before I actually step into talking about Park, which is a whole other can of worms, is Park's younger brother, Josh Sheridan. So both Josh and Park are half Korean. Obviously, Park looks more Korean. If you read the book, you know that it's constantly exoticized. It's constantly pointed out how small and frail Park is. More on that later. But Josh Sheridan is the antithesis of Park. Where Park looks Korean, looks Asian, Josh looks white. He is habitually described in this book as being the white version of Park, the white brother. He's the white Sheridan. Rainbow Rowell uses Josh to emphasize how other Park is, how, different Park is, how Asian Park is. Josh is only described as being tall and buff to emphasize how small and dainty Park is. Josh is described as being super white only to emphasize how super not Park is. It's all in relation to fetishizing and exoticizing Park while watering down Josh's existence as a minority in this book. Even if Josh isn't being blatantly stereotyped like his mother is or Bibi and Denise are, he's still being solely characterized based on his race, and he's still not allowed to exist outside of his stereotypical confines. I think one key way to think about Josh's existence in this book and how it relates to Park and how it is used to further otherize Park centers on their names, the name choices. Selecting a name for your character is an interesting thing, right? Usually authors use that to be like kind of an indicator of the character's personality. Their name might mean something in another language, or You know, it might be very aesthetic and really tie into how the character moves and feels and thinks throughout the book. It's an intimate choice. It's not something that's usually done willy-nilly, or even if it is, there's always like some kind of like, is that the right name for this character? There's always some kind of second thinking. So I think it's really interesting that Park's first name is a common Korean last name, right? Another Cho Chang here, if you guys know what I mean. Versus Josh being given a more white or, boring white, more of a racially ambiguous name. I think that's a very telling choice, especially since it's established in this book. And, as I mentioned earlier, Mindy, Park's mom, wants to assimilate really badly, right, when she moves to the United States. So why would she name one of her kids a really common Korean last name and name her other child not that? Like if she wanted to give Park more of a direct tie to his roots, then that's one thing. But to not do that to her other son and to also, be heavily characterized in this book as wanting to be accepted by her peers, wanting to be assimilated, like why would she choose that? And more to the point, why would Rainbow Rowell choose to name one of her characters in this book a famous Korean last name? Like, it's almost as if Rainbow Rowell put no thought into Park's characterization outside of his race. It's almost as if she really wants to emphasize how other and exotic Park is, especially when you compare, Eleanor and Park together. Their two names are the titles of this book. You have Eleanor, like a classic European name, a classic, white name, juxtaposed against Park. I think it's pretty clear that either Rainbow Rowell put no thought into his name choice and just went with whatever sounded good, which she kind of dropped the ball there then if she did no research into what the name means, especially in the culture that she wants to write about a little bit. Or she was like, fuck it, I want him to be Korean. People need to know that he's Korean when they look at the title of this book, and being Korean is the most important thing about Park, obviously, so I'm gonna name him Park because I want to, and because I'm ignorant, and because this is a bad writing choice, and I've made so many of them so far, and I need to keep up consistency. Yes. So now we're going to shift away from secondary characters and how that was a disaster in this book, and talk about Eleanor and Park and how their relationship is not the best, but more specifically about how Park is a poorly written character. The first thing I think is important to talk about is the fact that Eleanor and Park, despite being presented as a story about two characters who happen to fall in love, is more so a story about Eleanor, and Park just happens to be there. And this is best characterized in the fact that if you remove Park from the book Eleanor and Park, the book could still exist with very minor changes. But if you remove Eleanor from the book, there is no book to speak of. The bulk of Park's chapters are reactionary to Eleanor's. Park's existence in this book is contingent upon Eleanor's. This is not a story about two people, it's a story about one person and like a fourth of a person, like a very, very half-baked person, is what I'm trying to get across. And I think the problem is rooted in the fact that Eleanor is a fully fledged character. She has her own story arc. It's very established in this book. She has her struggles. She has her clear plot. Park is not. He is a mashup of stereotypes and surface-level characteristics and, half-baked character arcs. He's not given the same due diligence as Eleanor, and it clearly shows in this book, and it leads to a lot of racial problems in this book, and it leads to a lot of the poor representation that I was mentioning earlier. This bad writing is really the death of this book, honestly. I feel like it's easy to kind of forgive ignorance if you can see that the effort was put in to carry out, proper representation. But you can't say that about Rainbow Rowell. Like, you can't say, oh, she really tried her best in representing Korean Americans and black girls and black people in general. And, you cannot say that about Rainbow Rowell. You can say they're there, characters of colors are there. Whether or not the work was put in to, make them seem halfway human is up in the air, but they're there. And the fact that Park is the main character in this book, he's a point of view chapter, but he's paid dust, really is a problem. It's a problem. It's an awful, awful problem. So unlike the secondary characters that I was mentioning earlier, Park isn't just stereotypical, although he does have a handful of stereotypes attributed to them. I won't say he's a stereotypical character because there is more to him than that. Any of the ground gained by Rainbow Rowell in, making Park a little more than his stereotypes is lost immediately due to the fact that Eleanor habitually reduces Park down to his race. In this book, Park is little more than an Asian boy that Eleanor happens to think is cute. And I mean, that's problematic because, like I mentioned earlier, Eleanor is the main character of this book, despite what Rainbow Rowell and who published this book? I can't tell. What the fuck is this? Whoever published this book would like you to believe this isn't a story about two people, it's Eleanor's story. And in her framing this book that way, you know, ultimately Park comes across as being, you know, nothing more than a thing that Eleanor lusts after that happens to be exotic. It takes about this long for Park to get any real depth attributed to him. Up until that point, this is solely Eleanor's story, but I mean, he gets some characterization, a semblance of a character arc. He gets, you know, a few subplots thrown his way, although they're all pretty much half-assed and not given as much importance as Eleanor, but it's there. Another thing, this is the front of the book, this is the end of the book, right? These are the worst pages in this book, I swear. And it takes about this long for Park to interact with his racial identity in any substantial way. And this is going to become relevant when I talk about the themes that Rainbow Rowell attempts in this book. But yeah, it takes him up until like this much is left of the book to really get any depth regarding his racial identity, which again proves the point that Eleanor is the one that's framing the bulk of this book. She's framing, you know, the conversations had in this book, the themes presented in this book, and that becomes problematic because whenever race is talked about in this book, it's always in, you know, a negative context because Eleanor is very bad when it comes to race. Everything is either other or exotic when it comes to Eleanor, so she's not the best person to have driving the conversation if you ask me. But yeah, the pages that I was talking about are pages 275 through 277. Park and Eleanor are on a date. Nice. Park admits that he feels insecure while on this date. He feels insecure because, quote, nobody thinks Asian guys are hot, and he explains that although Asian girls are, you know, fetishized, at least they're desired. Quote, everything that makes Asian girls seem exotic makes Asian guys seem like girls. Eleanor in this scene tries to comfort Park by saying, quote, I don't know if I'm thinking you're cute because you're Korean, but I don't think it's in spite of it, which isn't the best thing to console your partner with whenever they're talking about how, you know, they feel ugly, they feel undesired based on the way the world sees them. But she continues developing this awful thought by saying, quote, maybe I'm just really into Korean guys. So Park after that says he doesn't know what it means to be Korean, and expresses that he's insecure about the fact that being Korean is his main thing that people attribute to him. His race is the first thing people notice about him. It's the most central thing that people like associate with him, but he doesn't know what it means to be Korean. And Eleanor was like, why does that matter? I don't know what it's like to be Danish or some shit. Like, she says something European. Park explains to Eleanor like, well, no, it's different for you because you're white, and when you're white, you're the default. There's always going to be more to you than your race. You're never just, you know, Eleanor, that white girl, while I'm always Park, that Asian boy, which I'll get to that later. But yeah, so at this point, Eleanor goes, well, being Asian isn't your main thing to me. Your main thing is that you're cute, Park, like, so cute. So this interaction, these pages, the reason why they are lit up like a fucking Christmas tree in orange is because orange is my color when it comes to bad racial choices in this book. And why this interaction is problematic, more than just the fact that Eleanor blatantly like fetishizes Park, and you know, Park is like, oh, thank you for wanting to be with me because I'm Korean. It makes me feel so much better about, you know, being Korean being the only thing about me that people see. And you know, this just half-baked attempt at Park interacting with his racial identity, but then, you know, being immediately nullified by Eleanor saying, I think Asian guys are cute, is the fact that, and if you've heard anything about Rainbow Rowell and this book and how it's poorly done in representation, Eleanor, throughout this book, refers to Park as being that blank Asian kid, that stupid Asian kid, that boring Asian kid, that quiet Asian kid, that dumb Asian kid, that smart Asian kid. He's that Asian kid to Eleanor. I think I could forgive that if Rainbow Rowell used this starting off point to establish some kind of character arc. You know, if throughout the book he goes from that Asian kid to that Korean kid. Just a little bit of ground being gained, you know, he's not just Asian, he's Korean. But no, even after Eleanor discovers that Park is Korean, he's always going to be that Asian kid, because obviously, like how she refers to his mom as being, you know, a China person, all of East Asia looks the same. Maybe all of Asia looks the same. It's all one fucking place, honestly, if you ask me. Like, they all have the same culture, the same look, they all have the same, values and beliefs, and they're all just one big group. Even when Eleanor and Park start dating, he's still that Asian kid to her. She still uses that to refer to Park. Maybe it becomes that beautiful Asian kid, that beautiful Asian boy, perhaps. He becomes more than a kid. But he's still Asian. That's the one thing that Eleanor attributes to Park. And up until this exchange happens in which Park goes, I feel uncomfortable with having people only see me as my race. It makes me feel insecure. It makes me feel badly. And even as Eleanor tells Park, oh, your race isn't the only thing about you, it's not the main thing about you, I don't think of race being the main thing about you, she still refers to Park as that fucking Asian kid. You would think Rainbow Rowell would think to herself, okay, now time to establish some kind of growth, some kind of character arc. We have to bring this home, we have to bring this revelation home that Park feels uncomfortable with his racial identity, and Eleanor has been referring to Park by his racial identity, and she would, maybe make Eleanor interact with the fact that she calls him Asian kid, or maybe she'll just stop calling Park Asian kid. Like, we don't even have to be there for the mental process that leads to that. Just maybe don't do that after you have this conversation with Park. But no, literally the end of the book, she still refers to Park as that Asian kid. It's gross. It's gross and fetishistic, especially after she goes, oh, maybe I'm just into Korean guys. It offers that whole, Asian kid thing a different twist that's somehow worse than just being otherizing. It's also fetishistic. Like I mentioned earlier, Rainbow Rowell really tries to establish a handful of themes throughout this book. And, she establishes a lot of themes throughout this book. She tackles domestic abuse, she tackles fat phobia, she tackles bullying and first love, she tackles poverty, did I say poverty? She tackles hypermasculinity, and she tries to tackle casual racism and racial identity, and just a bunch of things are tackled in this book. But all of the themes centering on race, all of the themes centering on Park, period, all seem underdeveloped, especially when held up against the themes Eleanor handled in this book. Like the fat phobia, the domestic abuse, the poverty are all significantly better developed throughout this book than racial identity and racism. And I think that just naturally happens whenever you have so many themes in your book. You have to delegate them. Some themes become more of a priority than others, but it's a shame that racism and racial identity are in this book, kinda, sorta, but they're heavily deprioritized in comparison to the things that Eleanor goes through. And that's because I think, like I mentioned earlier, Eleanor is the one framing the story. And Eleanor has no subtlety, no nuance when it comes to race. You're either other or you're fetishized. There's no in between. And when you have that kind of person framing the narrative, naturally any theme you try to establish dissolves instantly. Park isn't the one driving the story, Eleanor is. And so any themes centering on Park are going to be underdeveloped, are going to be just poorly written. If Rainbow Rowell wanted to have a romance between a white character and a biracial character, she could have done that, just not make race such a huge aspect of it, Or if she wanted to tackle race and racism in this book and racial identity, while also having an interracial relationship between a biracial character and a white character, she could have done that if she put more effort into the racial identity. Ultimately, what this book has in regards to race and representation is poorly written stereotypical secondary characters. Nice. We have a white main character who filters everything through racial lenses that either otherizes or fetishizes. Nice. We have a main character who is completely underdeveloped, who is completely fetishized throughout this book, who is a hodgepodge of underdeveloped themes and a handful of stereotypical traits, coupled with the half-assed attempt at making this book about racism in the last 10% of the book. All of this just leads to a poor reading experience when it comes to race and representation, and I feel like that's definitely where Rainbow Rowell dropped the ball. The poor writing choices plus the ignorance leads to this fucking mess. Eleanor and Park, more poor representation and bad writing. Am I right, ladies? Am I right? One last thing that I forgot to mention, another thing that Eleanor did in this book, whenever she's being bullied and people are laughing at her, the student body is laughing at her, she always makes it a point to point out the black girls are laughing at her, the black people are laughing at her. On page 23, when being bullied, Eleanor notes that, quote, the other girls all laughed, even the black girls. laughing at Eleanor was Dr. King's mountain. Nice. On page 55, Eleanor is having like a standoff with one of like her bullies, and Eleanor is like noting the fact that everyone was there watching, and she goes, quote, "The black girls too. Everybody wanted a piece of this." And it's kind of like really hammering home this idea of, oh, the black people too. Like, Eleanor is so low on the social status that, you know, the black people are ahead of her, the blacks are ahead of her. It's just gross. It's gross. And I feel like whenever you group an entire race together, you're never doing the right thing. Whenever you say black girls, especially as a white character, as a white author, you're never doing the right thing. That should be a red flag in regards to representation immediately. Can there be any positive mentioning of race in this book? Like, is that not possible? Is Rainbow Rowell allergic to that? Because if she is, then provide a doctor's note. I'll write this off completely. But, you know, I don't think that's likely. My last talking point, I promise. And then class will be dismissed. You can go off and do whatever you want. Watch that ASMR video you've been putting off. Am I going to still read books by Rainbow Rowell? Probably. I don't know, I think it's an important thing to give people a second chance, to give people the opportunity to grow, to take criticism and to make something of it. I feel like, you know, you're not a traitor if you point out the fact that there is improper representation throughout this book, there are poor choices made throughout this book, but then still choose to read another book by her. But likewise, you're not bad if you decide to never read Rainbow Rowell again. There are no wrong choices in regards to how to handle this information, right? The only wrong choices, I guess, would be first and foremost ignoring it completely, telling the community that, you know, is complaining about this book to shut the fuck up, you don't know what you're talking about, like, there's nothing wrong with this book, you're being overly sensitive, blah, 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 blah. And then second, keep the same energy with authors of color. Thank you very much. I'm sick and freaking tired of, you know, people giving Rainbow Rowell a million freaking chances but then canceling the author of Spin the Dawn. I'm sick of people, you know, supporting Rainbow Rowell but then canceling the author of Not Your Perfect Mexican, the one that said that we shouldn't have trigger warnings in books. That one. People canceling her and putting her on their never buy list because she said something that they disagree with. You know, keep that same energy for authors. If you choose to give Rainbow Rowell a second chance, then give authors of color a second chance. What is there to say? I hope this review was somewhat decent. I'm very tired. I have school tomorrow at 9 in the morning and it's like 3 a.m. right now. So, yeah. See you guys in the next video. I've been Sarah. You've been reading with Sarah. Bye-bye.